Hey everybody, welcome back to the Scandinavian woody, also known as Mjölnir. In the first episode we worked on the layout of the coaster, in the second we got to the natural setting, and in this one we're gonna work on the scenery. Which means most of all, the station, since that's the most scenery that I'll be getting in here. To be honest, the time is pretty limited. I just kind of decided to make this little project over the course of a couple of days to practice with getting a realistic coaster done in the game, and I'm not gonna get too much into scenery, but I did want to put a lot of effort into the station and try a theme which I have rarely tried before. I've actually done it once in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, which I have yet to show, but it's a Norwegian kind of theme, though in a sense it's also more general Scandinavian, because I'm drawing a lot of inspiration from the traditional stave churches. Not in the sense that I'm gonna be making the construction or the religious purpose of one, but the station, even though it's gonna have a standard station construction, is gonna have a roof that very heavily borrows from the stave churches to create a similar kind of silhouette, which I just wanted to very quickly sort of sketch out with layering these different roofs right here. So here you can already kind of see what the general layout of the station is going to be and what the roof is going to look like when it comes to the shape. I'll definitely detail it a lot more and make my own towers in the future, so that'll look a bit fancier. But this is really the general idea. We have that sort of typical stave church build-up of different roofs with one large tower on the right side, and that's pretty much what it's going to look like. And underneath that sort of very complicated roof, it's just going to be sort of a disguised, very simple station. It's just going to rest on some wooden pillars, and most of the focus elsewhere is going to be on the rockwork and on the foliage and the pathwork around the station. And again, I'm not going to get too much into this because my time is very limited, and even if you can't really tell as you're watching this episode, recording this thing has been pretty chaotic, and it's just been recorded in all of these very small little patches of time that I had throughout the day. So it's a little bit messy, but we'll hopefully get the coaster finished in a pretty nice way at the end of this episode, so that tomorrow, just before the beta of, or just before Planet Coaster is fully released, we can get into a POV of the coaster and start some new stuff. So at this point I'm just kind of finishing up the decorations. One thing which you'll always see with these kind of Scandinavian, you might almost say Vikings, though I think actually that's kind of a slur. In any case, what you often see is these decorations on the side of the roofs. Now I would have loved to have these decorations be dragon heads or something really cool and fantasy-ish, but there is no such thing in the game that would actually fit in terms of size and in terms of color, so I just kind of put together lots of different wooden brackets to get the general idea of what you usually see as decorations on these kinds of buildings. Now something that I talked about in the last episode, as I made the old wooden stone bridge, is actually how these rocks can actually be pretty handy for buildings as well. Now I didn't want to just say that, I actually wanted to follow it up with actually trying to use these rocks to make building pieces, so that's what I'm doing right here. At first I had the couple of mossy rocks thrown in, but then again this is a building and technically it should have been built pretty recently and the textures didn't mingle all that well, so I ended up just putting the same textures on the entire floor. But what I was going for here is really a rough layout as a foundation of like some rocks that were just sort of piled together to make this rocky wall. At first I thought I could maybe also just use the castle walls in the game, but the problem with those is just that they are just entirely straight. They're very well made, and that is exactly what I didn't want to have, because these churches are medieval, they're not that well built, and it's a pretty odd looking theme, even if this coaster is of course very recent. So that's why I wanted to put these different rocks together. In a sense I'm also cheating here, because what these kinds of buildings are very known for is that they are made 100% out of wood. So I guess I'm cheating over there, but I was trying to make that up by actually putting posts in there which are made out of pure logs. I found this log in the scenery tab and I'm not really sure what it's really meant for. It seems to just be a log that you should place around as a scenery item, but you can very well use these kinds of things as support posts, especially if you're heading into sort of foresty or Scandinavian theme. So I figured I might use these logs along with some regular wooden posts with a bit of a darker color for some contrast as 2 ways to support the roof. And so the most important parts are the logs, since they're pretty thick and jump out quite a bit. And just quickly making the other side of the station, which is almost identical to the front. I didn't want to have like a backside which I just completely neglected, so I did want to put a little bit of work into it, but it's quite similar to the front, except for one thing. I had this little flat roof that sort of just juts out at the end, because there is the station gates right there, so people are gonna have to wait in line. And the worst thing in the Scandinavian weather, especially if I were to put this coaster in Norway, I don't really have an exact location, because it's really inspired by many of the woodies that you see around Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and these types of buildings are scattered throughout Northern Europe. Like it's quite similar in a sense to, say, Thunder Coaster or Wildfire, all that stuff. So the location isn't exact in this case, but you know, the weather in there is pretty bad, so I at least want to have a cover over the entire station. That was hell of an off-topic sentence just for one little thing, one little reason to cover that part of the station, but yeah, that's why we're doing it. Which is one thing that doesn't really fit into the theme, so I wasn't too sure if I was gonna put that straight section in there. But then again, this is really just a building that's meant to look like a stave church, and construction-wise, it really isn't one at all. Also, I wanted to add like some extra little details here and there, have some open work scenery instead of just putting walls everywhere. So these little wooden pillars and wooden brackets work together quite nicely to make any kind of detail that you're really looking for. You can usually combine these different pieces and turn them into shapes that you don't otherwise really have, and that's one thing which I really love to do with this kind of thing. Now, through this entire time, I was sort of figuring that I could put the entrance and the exit on the front, so exactly underneath the roof that sticks out there. Turns out that that wasn't the case, because that's actually where the operator booth was for the exit, so I couldn't put the exit straight in the front of the building. And while my OCD was tripping for a second there, I actually figured it might be better in the end, since it allowed me to have this little curvy road on the exit, and here the queue is just going to be straight. But on the exit, I think it's a little bit more interesting than a straight staircase, like that's symmetrical and parallel to the building itself, since it just allows to use that very large open space that I have in front of the station to have some interesting rockwork and some interesting foliage, and mostly some nice interaction between the path, the rocks and the foliage. So in the end, I'm actually quite happy with how that little curved path turned out. Also, one thing to really note about this station and everything around it is that it's pretty strategically placed, so you can actually see the station over the river as you come into this area over the bridge, if that makes any sense. And basically we have this cool sightline of the station from the bridge. Also, you can see the coaster, the station straight ahead if you're looking from the river on the other side of the map here. So that's a pretty cool sightline that I'm quite happy with as well. And yeah, on the coaster, if you're on the coaster itself, you're just gonna see that sort of pop up in the background, and it just sits right in the middle of this valley where I think it just works best to have it. So scenery-wise and like placement-wise, how it sort of sets up the scene in relation to what's around it, I'm actually really happy about this station. And honestly, I think that's the most important theme. You can make the station as beautiful as you want, but if it doesn't really fit together in the general area, if the area around it doesn't really complement the station itself, I don't think there's much of a point to overly detailing it. So many of the things in this station will actually stay quite simple, since the general shape, layout and placement of it, I figured in this case was more important. Anyway, I just quickly made that rocky path. I'm really happy with how the new fences are, and the new path textures. They actually came just in time, since the new path textures all have this sort of more Scandinavian feeling to them. At least they work a lot better in this kind of theme. And the new fences are definitely a lot less generic as well. The old fences were really just metallic railings without any kind of specific genre detailing on them, but the new iron fences, I think, work out alright in this sort of theme, and the same goes for the wooden fences, which I saw at some point but I didn't end up using because I didn't like the textures that much. I am now just doing a little bit more detailing on the station, and now we're gonna get into what is one of the hardest parts of this entire building, and what I ended up spending a disproportionate amount of time on, probably, but it sort of feels like the most important part. It's the spire, and I think, you know, the thing about the spire is that I had to make it completely custom, which means a lot of pulleys and a lot of work. But it's the thing that pops up the most, it's the tallest part, and it's the part that gives the building the most of its shape. And since this is such a small spire, I definitely wanted to use the smallest pieces I could to get the shape right, and as you can see, every now and then I'm also sort of placing it on top of the building, just to kind of see if it's really going to work out, how it's actually going to look on top of the building before I move on, with the idea that, yeah, it's safe, and I can go on like this. So I'm just sort of adjusting the little brown box underneath the spire. I didn't want to end up doing too much detailing on this, really just keep it down to the shape and get the shape right, and aside from that, don't overly detail it, because you wouldn't see this kind of thing overly detailed in real life either, and it sort of has to be like with a little sprinkle of fantasy, but still like it could potentially be built by some pagans in like many centuries ago. So that's generally what we're going for. And at this point the lower part of the spire is almost done. I just wanted to quickly redo that little section underneath it. Also recolor some of these little parts. I wanted to stay away from using brackets to make my own shingle roofs before, since it's one thing that takes up a lot of pulleys and a lot of pieces and a lot of time. But it actually works out perfectly, especially if you give them slightly different colors. Make some of the wooden brackets black, some grey, some slightly darker shade of grey. You can actually get a very shingle-like texture, as you see over here, especially if you move some of them out a little bit, set them offset a bit. Don't make them all 100% straight, just leave it a bit more natural, and you can actually make your own pretty good shingle textures and turn those things into any kind of shape you want. So if you're looking to do that kind of thing, it's very well possible with these wooden brackets kind of items. Now the top part of the spire is pretty much the same, just a little bit steeper, because I did want to make the spire quite steep. And then as for the ending, just putting a very simple sort of thing on top of it, and that should more or less finish the spire in a little bit. And that'll also be the station almost finished. At this point it's really only finishing touches that I want to add to the station, but aside from that, the general idea is there, and that's really what I would also recommend in any kind of case. I don't always do this myself, but when it comes to making any kind of building that's pretty large or something that you haven't really done before, or it's very important in the park that you're making, always just try to get the very basic idea of it out first, and if you're happy with how the shape is, if you're happy with how it's placed, only at that point start really doing the detailing and doing some trial and error of how certain things are going to look. Otherwise, you could either, from my personal experience, end up just abandoning the building halfway through and have like one half of a beautifully finished detailed building and the other half just unfinished and forgotten until the end of time. Or it turns out that the shape of the building isn't that good and you've got this beautifully detailed building that you spent so much time on, and in the end it just doesn't work out and something feels off about it, which is the one thing that I hate happening. So generally, even if I don't always do this myself, I always try to get the general shape out and then start detailing stuff. Even though the detailing is probably also the easiest part, I would say, since it's just a lot of adding stuff here and there. It can also give you a lot of time. By the way, I see so many of these comments about like, how are you gonna do certain things, or how do you do this, or how do I even start? And one thing to not underestimate is how much time this kind of stuff takes. Like, from my time lapses, I obviously cut out sometimes the parts that it doesn't go that well, that I end up getting stuck and not really know what to do. And also these things are sped up 12 times, so spending many hours just on one station building is definitely not something that you're only guilty of. There are so many people to do that kind of thing, and you know, the hours that you spend on a station building, that's really just what you need to put into it. You can't just quickly build down a building and make it good in an instant, and while it might look that way in my time-lapses, these time-lapses are very fast, and in real life it takes a lot of time and trial and error as well. Anyway, I'm going off topic for the last bit of this video, since it's just a lot of general work, you know, finishing up the entire coaster, doing the queue, doing some more foliage, doing some finishing touches on the station, that kind of stuff. And at this point, I sort of want to say goodbye to it. Actually, one last thing. I saw a lot of comments, and yeah, I'll just sort of come back to comments. While I definitely want to reply to them as much as I can, I think some are worth talking about in the videos as well. And the name Mjölnir, as bad as I am still at pronouncing it, the reason that I chose to spell it this way is because I think it's the most internationally known way of spelling the word. You guess why. And that's sort of what you're looking for in a roller coaster. There are definitely many other ways that, you know, in some older or current Scandinavian languages you spell it otherwise, but I feel like this is the best way to spell it for an international market. Would this be a real coaster? Also, I was originally going to make this a Russian coaster and call it Mjölnir, but it just doesn't feel as, like, it's not a very known word, and it's not one that's as recognizable as Mjölnir, because even if half of the world doesn't know how to pronounce it, it's pretty much a word that many people do know. Also, I saw some stuff about making trolls out of stones, and while I think it's a really cool idea to make sculptures out of these rockworks, and I think it's definitely an idea that many people can take and, you know, just try it in the game and see what you can do with it. It's one thing that I just don't have enough time for. In this case, I'm really just trying to finish up this coaster in a realistic way, get it out there before the final releases, which I'm pretty hyped for, and, you know, just be safe and sound for the future. Speaking of which, there were many positive comments about Planet Coaster College, and while I already sort of set up many things, this pretty much cemented that I'll be making some videos of that. Especially, there was also a new topic about building layouts, which I think is pretty interesting because I don't actually have any kind of like direction that I take toward making the layouts of buildings, except just avoid squares. But that's one thing that I can pick up, but a lot of them were also about like how to make certain coasters, and still the topic of RMCs and wooden coasters in general is something that I think is pretty interesting to do some stuff about. So generally I think I'll make these series initially mostly probably about the different types of coasters that we have in game, how they work and how you can make layouts for them, but also some parts of the building process. And the reason I want to do it this way is because I don't want to end up making tutorials which are just follow me along and recreate this building as I am building it, because I don't think that really contributes to being able to build things yourself, which is ultimately what you're going for. So I'll just sort of try to find specific niches in building things and explain a bit more about them. So really topics like making layouts or building weenies or how certain coasters work, instead of showing you how to make a Japanese theme or a certain theme, because I think that's a lot less constructive in a sense. Anyway, that's enough about my future plans. I'm gonna leave it at this. Thank you guys for watching so far. I'll be finishing up this series with a POV and cinematic video tomorrow, or actually it might be today, I'll see, very soon in any case. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next series.